The laughter echoed across the airstrip without restraint. A veteran American Green Beret captain stood watching from a short distance, arms folded, openly amused as a group of Australian SAS soldiers worked inside a dusty garage. What he saw confirmed everything he believed about how wars were supposed to be fought and how they were not. The Australians were taking hacksaws to their rifles, sawing chunks off the barrels of standard-issue military weapons as if precision engineering meant nothing. To the Americans, this wasn't improvisation. It was incompetence. The captain shook his head and said it out loud for anyone nearby to hear. "Look at those idiots. They won't last a week." If you want to understand how real wars are fought, not how manuals say they should be, this is where the story turns. Subscribe now, because what follows doesn't just challenge American doctrine in Vietnam. It exposes why it failed. What the captain didn't understand was that he wasn't witnessing chaos. He was witnessing preparation, just not the kind his doctrine recognized. Earlier that same morning, an American intelligence officer stepped off a Huey helicopter at the Australian base and immediately recoiled. The smell hit him before the rotors slowed. It was layered, aggressive, biological, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, human bodies that had not been washed in weeks. He had spent 18 months in Vietnam, walking through field hospitals, burned villages, and mass graves. None of that prepared him for this. His first assumption was logistical failure. His second was disciplinary collapse. No professional army, he believed, would allow its soldiers to reach this level of filth voluntarily. He approached an Australian lieutenant with an offer: soap, hygiene kits, fresh supplies. The response was immediate and edged with something close to contempt. The smell was not neglect. It was doctrine. That single sentence cracked something fundamental in the officer's understanding of the war. American soldiers were taught that cleanliness was discipline. Discipline was professionalism, and professionalism was survival. The Australians had learned the opposite lesson. In the jungle, cleanliness made you visible. Soap, deodorant, toothpaste, insect repellent, these weren't comforts. They were signals. As the officer continued to observe, the contradictions multiplied. The rifles were wrong. Their proportions were off. Barrels shortened by nearly 15 centimeters. Flash suppressors removed. Crude forward grips welded from scrap or carved from wood. Weapons that looked closer to insurgent tools than elite military hardware. Then there was the footwear. Several troopers weren't wearing boots at all. They wore sandals, Ho Chi Minh sandals, cut from old automobile tires, identical to those used by the Viet Cong. To American eyes, everything about this violated doctrine. To the Australians, doctrine had already failed. What no one on that airstrip realized yet was that within hours, American doctrine would collapse under fire. Radios would fill with panic. Artillery would pound empty jungle. Firepower would solve nothing. And when the moment came when American soldiers were pinned down and dying, the only men who could reach them were the ones being mocked. The ones who smelled like the jungle, carried butchered rifles, and moved so slowly they barely seemed alive. What separated the Australian SAS from every other Western force in Vietnam was not courage, marksmanship, or aggressiveness. It was a deliberate decision to disappear. Where American doctrine emphasized presence, noise, speed, firepower, the Australians built their entire method around the opposite principle. If the enemy cannot detect you, he cannot kill you. This was not theory. It was a system refined through repeated jungle patrols, where survival was measured not by engagements won, but by engagements avoided, until success was guaranteed. The foundation of the method was scent discipline. American patrols arrived in the jungle carrying a chemical signature completely foreign to the environment. Soap, deodorant, shaving cream, insect repellent, commercial toothpaste, even cigarettes, all of it produced odors that lingered in humid air for hours. Viet Cong scouts learned to recognize these smells with ease. Interrogations repeatedly confirmed that American patrols could be detected from hundreds of meters away before they were ever seen or heard. The Australians removed every one of those signals. Weeks before insertion, they stopped using soap entirely. Deodorant and toothpaste were abandoned. Cigarettes were replaced with local tobacco or eliminated altogether. Diets were adjusted to include indigenous foods that altered body chemistry. By the time a patrol entered the jungle, its members no longer smelled human. They smelled like rot, mud, and vegetation, exactly like the environment itself. The results bordered on the unbelievable. Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything out of place. In one verified incident, an enemy fighter stepped directly onto an Australian trooper's boot, glanced down, saw nothing but jungle debris, and walked on. The trooper did not move. He did not react. He did not even breathe visibly. In that moment, invisibility was not camouflage. It was behavior. Weapons doctrine followed the same logic. The standard Australian service rifle, the L1A1 self-loading rifle, was accurate, powerful, and respected worldwide. But in jungle terrain, where visibility rarely exceeded 15 meters, its long barrel was a liability. It snagged on vines and bamboo, forcing stops that created sound. The Australians shortened the barrel deliberately, removed flash suppressors, and added crude forward grips. Ballistic range was sacrificed because range did not exist. What remained was a compact, devastating close-quarters weapon, firing 7.62mm rounds capable of stopping an enemy instantly and penetrating thick bamboo cover. Accuracy at 400 meters was irrelevant when no one could see past 15. Footwear completed the illusion. Australian patrols wore captured Ho Chi Minh sandals made from old automobile tires, identical to Viet Cong footwear. Tracks left behind were indistinguishable from enemy movement. A tracker encountering those prints assumed friendly forces had passed and raised no alarm. Combined with counter-tracking techniques, walking in streams, stepping on roots and rocks, brushing out trails, the Australians became nearly impossible to follow. The hunters could not find them. Underlying all of this was attitude. American units often referred to the enemy with contempt, assuming technological superiority would decide the outcome. Australians referred to Viet Cong fighters with formal respect, studying their methods rather than dismissing them. Enemy success was analyzed, not excused. This respect translated directly into caution, patience, and survival. The final component was movement speed. Australian patrols advanced at approximately 100 meters per hour. This was not slowness. It was control. Every step was followed by minutes of complete stillness. The jungle soundscape recovered between movements. Birds continued singing. Insects continued droning. There was nothing for enemy listening posts to detect. At that pace, Australians heard the enemy long before the enemy ever sensed them. This was why the statistics disturbed American analysts. In identical terrain, Australian patrols achieved kill ratios approaching 1 casualty per 500 enemy eliminated. American units in neighboring sectors averaged 1 to 12. The disparity was not marginal. It was structural. The Australians were not better soldiers. They were invisible. The American unit assigned to the operation in Long Province represented the U.S. Army at its most confident. A full company from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, 118 paratroopers, led by a decorated West Point-trained captain, moved into the jungle using methods that had defined American warfare since the Second World War. Helicopter insertion, rapid movement, standard formations, standard hygiene, standard firepower. Nothing about the plan suggested risk beyond what experience had already normalized. This was how American forces had operated across Vietnam for years. The problem was that the enemy heard them long before they saw anything. American movement created a signature the jungle could not hide. Snapping vegetation, displaced undergrowth, vibrations transmitted through roots, and the unmistakable scent of chemicals and tobacco carried on humid air. Viet Cong listening posts detected the approach from more than 300 meters away. That gave the enemy nearly half an hour to prepare. At 11:47 hours, the ambush was triggered. It was a textbook L-shaped killing zone, refined through years of fighting American units. Automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades opened simultaneously from 2 converging axes. The first 20 seconds were catastrophic. 23 American soldiers were hit before the formation could react. Men went down without ever seeing who fired the first shots. The captain survived only because he was positioned near the center of the formation rather than at point. He responded exactly as his training dictated. Return fire toward suspected positions. Establish a defensive perimeter. Call for artillery. Request helicopter gunships. Every step was executed correctly. None of it worked. Artillery rounds began impacting within 8 minutes, churning jungle into craters. Gunships arrived shortly after, raking tree lines with rockets and cannon fire. But the Viet Cong were not exposed. They were in prepared fighting positions, camouflaged, reinforced, and connected by covered trenches. They had endured American bombardment for years and knew how to survive it. When artillery landed, they stayed low. When gunships appeared, they shifted positions under canopy cover. The Americans could not see them. They fired at muzzle flashes, shadows, and guesses. The Viet Cong, meanwhile, could see everything. Every few minutes, another American soldier was hit by precise fire from invisible positions. Ammunition began to run low. Casualties mounted. The perimeter shrank. Firepower that was supposed to dominate the battlefield was reduced to noise and wasted steel. By 12:30 hours, more than 40 Americans were dead or wounded. The company was no longer maneuvering. It was enduring. The captain understood the reality before his superiors did. His unit was being dismantled methodically by an enemy his doctrine could not reach. Artillery was destroying empty jungle. Gunships were strafing phantoms. Infantry fire was answering threats it could not see. This was not a failure of courage or leadership. It was a failure of assumptions. At 12:51 hours, with casualties still climbing and options exhausted, the captain made the radio call he never expected to make. He requested assistance from the Australian SAS patrol operating independently in the same sector, the same patrol he had declined to coordinate with days earlier. It was not a call for backup. It was an admission that American doctrine had reached its limit. The Australian patrol received the radio transmission without surprise. 4 men, already deep in the jungle, listened as American radio traffic grew more frantic by the minute. Casualty reports stacked up. Fire missions failed. The tone of the American captain's voice changed from command to containment. The Australian patrol leader understood the mathematics immediately. At the current rate, the American company would not hold much longer. Australian doctrine did not favor intervention. Their purpose was reconnaissance, not decisive engagement. 4 men entering an active firefight against a reinforced Viet Cong battalion violated every principle of force preservation. Yet doctrine also allowed for judgment, and judgment allowed for exceptions. Men were dying less than 2 kilometers away. The patrol leader made his decision in under a minute. When the American captain demanded that the Australians move faster, the response was calm and final. Speed would mean detection. Detection would mean Australian casualties without changing the outcome. The Americans would have to hold until the Australians could do something that actually mattered. What the Americans could not see was that the Australians were not moving toward them at all. They were moving through the enemy. Using the noise of the firefight as auditory cover, the patrol began infiltrating directly into the Viet Cong rear area. They moved at approximately 100 meters per hour, freezing for minutes at a time between steps. Enemy fighters passed within meters, focused entirely on the American position ahead of them. The Australians generated no sound, no scent, no visual disturbance. At one point, a Viet Cong soldier stopped less than an arm's length from the patrol leader, adjusted his gear, and moved on. The Australian did not blink. After 93 minutes of movement that would have been considered impossible by conventional standards, the patrol reached a position no American tactical planner would have believed achievable. They were inside the enemy perimeter, 35 meters from the Viet Cong battalion command post, surrounded by more than 200 fighters who had no idea they were there. Only then did the Australians begin to fight. The patrol leader started transmitting artillery corrections, not broad adjustments, but precise coordinates measured in meters. He could see the command element directing the battle. He could identify machine gun positions, inflicting the heaviest American casualties. He could observe ammunition distribution points and withdrawal routes. The first corrected fire mission landed directly on the battalion command post. Command and control ended instantly. The second eliminated a heavy machine gun position that had pinned American troops for over an hour. The third sealed the primary enemy withdrawal route. The fourth destroyed an ammunition cache, triggering secondary explosions that rippled through the perimeter. Within 18 minutes, the battle reversed completely. What had been a methodical destruction of an American company collapsed into confusion and flight. Leaderless, cut off, and suddenly exposed, the Viet Cong broke contact and withdrew. The Americans consolidated and prepared for extraction. Final counts showed 34 Americans killed and 51 wounded. Estimated enemy losses exceeded 80. The Australian patrol suffered 0 casualties. 4 men had entered the center of a battalion-sized engagement, dismantled it from the inside, and disappeared back into the jungle without being detected. The most damning evidence did not come from Allied after-action reports. It came from the enemy. Captured Viet Cong documents, recovered later in 1968, revealed something unprecedented: separate tactical doctrines for fighting Americans and Australians. Americans were to be ambushed aggressively. Australians were to be avoided. Against American units, the guidance emphasized predictability. Helicopter insertions, fast movement, detectable scent, reliance on artillery. Ambush hard. Inflict casualties, withdraw before firepower responded. Against Australians, the instructions were blunt. Do not pursue. Do not ambush unless unavoidable. Break contact immediately. Australians were described as impossible to track, impossible to smell, and dangerously patient. The documents used a specific term reserved for no other Allied force, Marung, phantoms of the jungle. Enemy activity in Australian-controlled sectors dropped sharply. Units that fought Americans daily refused to enter neighboring Australian areas. This was not coincidence. It was choice. The jungle had rendered its verdict.